Hello, you are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and today we're going to cover the next part of my series on Cenozoic bird evolution called Dinosaurs, the second chapter. So, I guess before we start, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Hanging in there.
That's good to hear. Yeah, this week has been really busy for me because it's been the annual meeting, annual conference of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, which is the basically the biggest conference in vertebrate paleontology that
Ooh.
happens every year. Of course, this year we had to do it online, so it's quite a different experience from how it usually is. But I think in some ways it is there are pros and cons. Let's put it that way to this kind of format. I think by far the biggest barrier, I suppose, um, is that it's very difficult to network in the online setting. There, you can't just drop into a conversation and you know introduce yourself to someone or run into someone in the hall and say hi or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah, so it can be quite difficult to get feedback on your presentations and all of that. But on the other hand, it's really cool to be able to catch all the talks I want to see because usually there would be several sessions going at once, and obviously you can't be in two places at the same time, so you inevitably have to prioritize and leave out some of the talks. So it's been nice to be able to catch all the ones that seem interesting to me, and the talks this year are they're pretty good. I mean, SCP is always a good time, but I've definitely seen quite a few really interesting talks and posters this year. So yeah, overall I'm pretty happy, and uh, I did get quite a few comments on my own talk. My own talk was about the skeleton, the wing skeleton, and the shoulder girdle of birds, and whether or not we can find informative characters that tell us about how birds are related to each other, which is actually very relevant to today's episode.
I was gonna say I heard all the jokes online about the censor that was on SVP that was bleeping out like really like simple, non-harmful words.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That. Oh man. Yeah. That was a very amusing, and yeah, it kind of blew up because I've seen a lot of mainstream news outlets reporting on it. So yeah, basically the online platform that we're using, it's evidently sort of a general platform that's made for hosting business conferences and so on, and so it's not meant to be specific to a paleo conference. And so the basically we have these Q&A boxes set up for each presentation, and if you have questions or comments you just type them into the box and you can talk with the presenter or with other people who have who have come to check out the talk. um, and the censoring in those chat boxes turned out to be very strict, and they censored out a number of words that make it very difficult for us paleontologists to talk about the things we study. Most notably, they censored the word bone.
Right.
So, yeah. Fortunately, once we let the management know about this, they fixed it pretty quickly, at least regarding the word bone. So, uh, that's
That's
good at
good.
least.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the slight trouble that we had with Dino Nerds for Black Lives.
Uh-huh.
The Twitch stream also kind of had a unfamiliar vocabulary when it came to paleontology,
Yeah.
so it would like highlight words being like, "Hey, is this like a slur or is this a swear word?"
Right, right.
And you have to manually go in and be like, "No, no, this is fine." I remember that very well.
Right, right. Yeah. So yeah, the censor gave us a lot of laughs and some headaches. It was pretty funny. There were some other notable words that got censored, like pubis. Obviously, we want to
Hmm.
talk about the pubis bone sometimes. Um, Sexual got censored, which is not that surprising, but obviously there were talks about sexual selection and sexual dimorphism, and people want to
Sure.
use that word. um, the word stream got censor for some reason, and I I think the most ridiculous censor I saw was probably the word lies. It's like, what? Why would you censor? Anyways,
Wow, that's like beyond strict.
right, right. Yeah, like yeah. Anyways, it was weird.
Well, that's funny. It's something to laugh about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, it was funny. So yeah, I guess that's my general impressions of SVP. It's running until tomorrow, Saturday, as of the time of this recording. Although the Q&As are actually going to end later this evening, so Friday evening. So hopefully people can get all their questions in before then. I've definitely tried to make an extra effort to comment on almost all of the presentations I've watched because I know that in this format it's very difficult to get any feedback on what you're presenting. So, yeah, I tried to do my part with that.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Otherwise, I don't know. Do you have any other comments about how the week has been, or SVP? I know you're not at SVP, but nonetheless.
Oh no. I guess just a kind of quick uh, update from our news episode
Hmm.
that we did at the beginning of the month. I finally saw David Attenborough's documentary,
Mm,
"The Life on Our Planet." You can hop over to my Twitter and do some digging to see my general comments, but generally I thought it was good. I did see that there were maybe some misleading things here and there regarding I guess for lack of a better word, the blame
hmm.
for the current environmental crisis being tacked on humans with a capital H instead of a subset of our industrialized societies. But
Right.
in general, I thought the format was brilliant. I mean, who better to talk about the environmental changes that have been going on for the past few decades
Hmm.
than a man who has literally been on every continent multiple times to be able to see these places with his own eyes change.
Right.
Um, so that decision, of course, was brilliant, and I'm very curious about the book. He's written David Attenborough has written a book,
Mm,
a companion for this film, in much the same way that he has for his Life of series.
right.
And apparently, he goes a little bit deeper into his thoughts and his feelings and his suggestions. So I look forward to checking that out. I
Mm,
think that comes out at the end of the month, or at least around that time, but I don't know for sure. Um, then on top of that, PBS has now been airing a new series, a three-part series called The Age of Nature,
hmm.
uh, which is kind of a nice follow-up to A Life on Our Planet because it basically shows different human communities around the world rewilding and uh, cleaning up the environment and making wild spaces for the benefit of not only the animals and plants living there, but the people as well. It's very enlightening. And it's narrated by Uma Thurman, which is pretty interesting because she played the character Kushana from Nausicaa: The Valley of the Wind,
Mm,
which is
right.
a Ghibli film that's very environmentalist leaning. So I thought that was pretty fitting. Um, but yeah, so I thought that was really great, and I know they are airing them on Wednesday nights
Cool.
at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so the first episode is already aired. I'm sure you can go on the PBS website and catch the full episode there. That's what they usually do. But then there'll be two other episodes in the following weeks. So I highly recommend it.
Great. That's great to hear.
That's all it with me.
All right then. I guess we can go on into the main subject of today's episode. So today we are going to introduce the group neoavians, which is a group that includes 95% of all living birds. And if you've watched through this series up to this point, you're probably tired of hearing me say that. Um, I decided to call the title of this lecture The Impossible Not, and, well, why that is will become clear in a few slides, hopefully. But first of all, Before we start on the next slide, I have a correction to make regarding the previous episode of Dinosaurs, the second chapter. So last time when I was talking about the group of very weird Hawaiian ducks called the moanalu, I showed the picture here on the right, and I said the skull on top was a genus called Kelly which is also known as the turtle-jawed moanalu. It's very weird. But this was turned out to be incorrect. I mislabeled the image and didn't notice I had. So the skull on top, shown here on the image on the right, is actually the species Thampitochen choliotis, and that is a different species of moanalu. Now, Kelly Netchen is shown on the left here in this image, and you can see it's a lot less completely known, but here you can definitely see why it has the name turtle-jawed moanalu, because that beak is very, very short and stout and very weird. And as it turns out, Kelly Netchen does not have the tooth-like kind of serrations on the bony part of its beak like the other types of moanalu do. It actually has a smooth margin of the beak, so that's pretty weird for moanalu. So yes, that's a correction I need to make, and many thanks to one of our listeners for pointing this out, Ilari Patila. I apologize if I completely butchered her name. And incidentally, Ilari is a very good paleo artist. He specializes in doing paleo artwork of birds, in fact, and he has done a lot of great restorations of both Cenozoic and Mesozoic birds and bird-like dinosaurs. So we will link his gallery in the description, and you should all check it out. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Nope.
All right. Okay, I guess we can move on and start talking about neoavians then. So, neoavians includes over 10,000 extant species, representing the majority, in fact the vast majority of living birds. The oldest known fossils of neoavians, or the ones we are pretty confident are neoavians at least, come from the Paleocene, so the first epoch in the Cenozoic era. Although there have been some Cretaceous fossils that have been suggested to possibly be neoavians, but most of them are, so fragmentary that it's very, very difficult to be sure about that. Now, because neoavians is so diverse and spans such a wide variety of forms, it actually has been quite difficult to identify anatomical features that unite this group. Neoavians was originally discovered with very, very early attempts at using molecular data to infer the phylogeny of birds. And a lot of those early results have since been shown to be probably incorrect, but the neoavians grouping has withstood the test of time, you could say, and is now very strongly supported. But nonetheless, we have identified a few anatomical features that seem to unite neoavians. So one of these is they have a ridge along the underside of one of the palate bones, the palatine. We've talked quite a lot about the avian palate here, in this series at least. And so if you look to the image on the right here, this is the underside of the skull of a neoavian, specifically a petrel. And so towards the bottom is the brain case, and towards the top is the back of the palate, and the two main bones you could see in the center there, where it's labeled CRV, that is the ridge along the underside of the palatines. So that is a feature that is found in neoavians, not so much in Galoencerans, the duck-like and chicken-like birds, or the paleonates, which are the ostrich-like birds. Another notable feature of neoavians is that, well, they don't have a phallus, or, as you might know, the structure as a penis, which is very odd. We mentioned back in the Galoenceran episode that some ducks have a very, very long phallus, but neoavians do not have one at all. Now, the phallus has been lost in some of the Gallo-Anserans as well, especially the Galliforms, but it does seem that this loss is convergent. So the loss in neoavians is, a feature that happened in the last common ancestor of neoavians, or after they diverged from the Gallo-Anseran lineage. Now, why the phallus has been lost in so many modern birds is a really good question, actually. We don't fully know. It's almost kind of cliche, but it has been very tempting traditionally to kind of associate every avian adaptation with flight. So, of course, people have suggested, oh, well, they lost the phallus to reduce weight and let them be able to fly more easily. But, if you think about it, a phallus doesn't weigh that much, right? In most cases, it doesn't, at least. So it's pretty unlikely that it would make such a big difference as to be selected for if it was a weight-saving adaptation. And of course, the ducks with really long penises, I mean, a lot of them fly just fine. So it doesn't seem like the most plausible explanation. Another one I've heard, which seems more plausible to me, is it might be for hygiene purposes. Now, basically, birds, unlike us placental mammals, birds only have, or I should say most placental mammals, because actually some placentals do have this structure as well, called the cloaca. So the cloaca is basically the one opening in the back end of the animal that everything comes out of. So they defecate through this hole, urinate through this hole, and they also have sex through this hole. And so, as you might imagine, with all these things going in and out of the same hole, it might be very prone to getting filthy and diseased, potentially. So some people have suggested that it is easier to keep the cloaca clean without a phallus, so because there's less contact between when the males and females are mating. What most neoavians do is that they just kind of quickly press their cloacas together when they're mating, and that's the end of the deed. So that is a possibility. And as for why the penis has not been lost in other animals that do have a cloaca, like a lot of the non-avian reptiles also have a cloaca, it is the ancestral condition for vertebrates. It is possible that it's because the very high metabolism, very high body temperature of birds means that it's easier for kind of disease-bearing microbes to live on them and potentially fester. It may be that keeping that area clean is more important for the very warm-bodied birds. It is an interesting idea. It seems plausible to me, but definitely a lot more research is needed. We don't actually know too much about why this interesting feature or lack of a feature evolved. And also, this is not so much a feature that is common to all neoavians, but compared to paleonates and Gallo-Anserans, the babies of neoavians tend to be more what we say altricial. That means their young are more dependent on parental care. So a lot of the baby Gallo-Anserans and paleonates, as soon as they hatch, they can walk around and they can eat. They can eat by themselves, feed themselves. Now, most of them still do receive some protection from their parents, but otherwise they are fairly self-sufficient. Whereas many of the neoavian groups, independently it seems, evolved towards altriciality, where the babies are much more dependent on the parent or parents, and they are often, nest-bound. They stay in the nest for a little bit before they're old enough to leave, and oftentimes they will be fed by their parents for a period of time before they can leave the nest. And neoavians also show increased tendencies towards arboreal habits, so tree dwelling. A lot of the major groups of tree dwelling birds are neoavians, again, probably convergent between several different groups, whereas most of the Gallo-Anserans and the paleonates are more ground dwelling birds. Now, we did see last time that there are a few tree dwelling galliform groups, and some anseriforms that nest in trees, but but nonetheless, they don't seem to have become as specialized for tree-dwelling life as some of the neoavians have. Do you have anything else to add?
I think it's interesting that the arboreal behaviors must have been independently acquired.
Hmm.
If we think about the hypothesis that the earliest Neornithians
Hmm.
were ground-dwelling birds.
Right.
So, like, once all the trees started to come back following the end Cretaceous extinction event, well, then now there were opportunities to use them.
Yep, exactly. That is what some of us suspect happened, indeed. Now, on the next slide, we can take a look at neoavian phylogeny, and, well, you can see that it is a very unresolved tree. So, what I have presented here is what is called a polytomy. So, Joan actually introduced this word in her last lecture. Now, we have seen polytomies in this series before, but I don't think I've actually used the word directly. So, a polytomy is basically a phylogenetic tree presented as having multiple branches coming off of the same node instead of just two. And most of the time, a polytomy indicates that there is uncertainty between the relationships of these groups. So it shows that there are several conceivable rearrangements of these lineages that are all plausible. And when it comes to neoavian phylogeny, it turns out that there are many rearrangements that have been recovered by recent studies. And so what I have here I have identified the major groups of neoavians that recent genetic studies largely agree exist, basically. That the groups that are recovered by recent molecular studies consistently. However, the relationships between each of these groups or among each of these groups is not consistently recovered at all by recent studies. And so we have this super unresolved phylogeny of neoavians, and I've color coded each of the major groups for reasons that will become clear in a moment. But
The lovely candelabra of birds.
you're right, yes. Now, throughout the rest of the series, we will be looking at each of these major groups in more detail, but just to briefly introduce each of them, going from left to right here. So we have Mirandornitheans, which includes the flamingos and grebes. We have Columbimorphi, which includes the pigeons and their close relatives. Otidimorphy includes the bustards, which is pictured there, cuckoos and turacos. Strysores includes nightjars, swifts, hummingbirds, and a number of other interesting groups. Opisthocomic includes only one living species, the hoatzin. Gruiformes includes the cranes and rails and their close relatives. Charadriformes includes the shorebirds, and they're a very diverse group, including things like plovers and sandpipers and gulls and auks. They're a very interesting group. Phaethontomorphy includes a group of seabirds called the tropic birds, which are one of which is pictured there, as well as two very unusual non-marine birds. One called the kagu, which lives in New Caledonia, and the other is called the sunbittern, which lives in the neotropics. Very weird assemblage of birds. Acornithes includes many of the aquatic neoavians, so things like loons, petrels, penguins, herons, storks, boobies, cormorants, pelicans. All of those are members of Acornithes. And finally, we have Teleraves, which is a big group of terrestrial and mostly tree-dwelling birds. So the various groups of birds of prey, parrots, kingfishers, woodpeckers, songbirds, and many, many, many others are all members of Teleraves. It's a massive group, the biggest out of all of the ones pictured here. So those are the major groups of neoavians. And let's go to the next slide. And here I have pictured some of the major studies on neoavian phylogeny that have come out in recent years. And here you can very clearly see how all of them have found very different topologies for neoavians. The results are not very consistent between each of these studies. But nonetheless, there are a few recurring patterns. For example, in 3 of the trees here, you can see that Phaethontomorphae and Acornithes are closely related to each other, so they form kind of a large clade of water-associated birds. You can see that in 2 of the trees here, Mirandornitheans and Columbimorphs form a clade, and that they are together the sister to the rest of neoavians, and that's in the Jarvis et al. And Reddy et al. Trees. Whereas in both Prum et al. And Cool et al., they find Otidimorphs and Columbimorphs to instead be more closely related, but still kind of a recurring pattern. Let's see, what else? And in both Jarvis et al. And Cool et al., they find Teleraves to be closely related to the core waterbird clade. So we do see some recurring patterns, but not that much consistency across the overall tree. And I guess I'll briefly mention that in the Reddy et al. Tree and a Cool et al. Tree, I have Otidimorphae marked with an asterisk, and that's because in these 2 trees, they don't recover the 3 main lineages, the bustards, turacos, and cuckoos, all as a single clade. So I think in Reddy et al., the turacos are recovered more closely related to the water birds, and in the Cool et al. Tree, the cuckoos are nested within the Columbimorphs instead. So, there's a little bit of uncertainty there still, but since in general we do still recover the same major groups, I just simplified it and marked it like that here. Do you have anything else to note about these trees?
Not particularly, just that certainly seems Teleraves has a very, I guess, a young position, if that's the right word, among all the lineages. That seems to be the trend.
Yeah, I guess you could say it's very deeply nested inside the clade. Yeah, that does seem to be true. So, yeah, very, very inconsistent results between these studies. This is pretty much one of the biggest problems in dinosaur systematics, and actually I would say probably one of the biggest problems in all of vertebrate systematics. And, that is probably surprising because birds are a super well-studied group of vertebrates. Lots of people study birds. They're very easy to observe. People have been observing birds for a very long time and, documenting all the different species and their differences between each other. And of course, we now have all this genomic data, which all of these studies have used. Very, very large genetic data sets that, in theory, should help us resolve complex relationships. But even now, even despite all of this, we still can't really agree on whether, I don't know, a flamingo is more closely related to a pigeon or to a penguin or to neither. So it is very striking that we have such a big problem here. And so that is why I called this lecture The Impossible Knot, as a reference to this very major challenge in avian systematics. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And we can talk a little bit about why is this so hard, because again, it's weird that it is so hard. So why might that be? Well, it seems that the most likely explanation is because there was a very rapid diversification at the base of neoavians, and we talked about this a little bit in the first episode of this series when I was introducing, crown birds, and we talked about when crown birds originated and all of that. And so something that pretty much all of the molecular trees have in common when you try to map them or try to implement a molecular clock and estimate the timing of the origin of these different groups is that the origin of neoavians and the origin of all these major groups was very rapid. They all diversified from each other very, very quickly. And, well, you might be able to guess how that might make inferring their phylogeny very difficult. Because since they all diversified from each other very quickly, there wasn't much time for the closely related groups to kind of accumulate many shared similarities with each other, whether in their morphology or even in their genetics. So basically, there isn't a very strong phylogenetic signal, no matter which type of data we use. And I guess another way of looking at it would be that all these groups became very different from each other very quickly, and so a lot of their similarities might have become obscured. Either way, that is quite likely to be the source of why this is so difficult. Now, there is one particular hypothesis that has been advanced in recent years, which basically proposes that the impossible knot is impossible to resolve, and this is called the hard polytomy hypothesis. So, I mentioned the word polytomy earlier for a reason, and that's because I said that usually a polytomy represents uncertainty in the relationships between groups, and when that's the case, we call that a soft polytomy. But there's also the concept of a hard polytomy, and that is the concept of when several different groups split from each other literally, basically, simultaneously. Now, we're talking on geologic timescales here, so in practice, maybe it took, between a few decades to a few thousand years or something. But nonetheless, basically, several different groups originating from a common ancestor, basically simultaneously, and that's called a hard polytomy. So it literally is several different groups branching from a single node and not just uncertainty. And some people have suggested that this was the case for the base of neoavians, that there was a hard polytomy there, and that is why we can't resolve them, because there's nothing to resolve. That's just how they evolved. I think it is a real possibility. There definitely could very well be a hard polytomy there, especially if the diversification was as quick as we think it probably was. But I think there's also reason to be a little bit cautious, because, again, I did point out previously that, well, I did mention it previously, other people have pointed out in papers, that there are some recurring patterns to these different molecular phylogenies, even if they don't fully agree with each other. And if it really was that all of these major groups diversified from each other pretty much simultaneously, you might expect that the signal would be essentially random. So you should be able to find, like, nearly all conceivable rearrangements of the tree with equal frequency, basically. But that's not really the case, because we do see a little bit of structure between the different trees, right? So it is possible that at the very least, it might not have been, a 10-way polytomy. So I showed something like, I think I showed like 10 different major groups in that polytomy earlier. It might have not have been literally a 10-way polytomy. Maybe it was, a smaller polytomy, like 6 or 7 ways, which is still pretty big polytomy. Or it might be that there is even more structure than that. And so I think we have to be very careful, because I'm not saying that proponents of the hard polytomy hypothesis are saying this, but sometimes they get come across as sounding like, well, it's a hard polytomy, we can't resolve it, so let's just move on and give up, basically. But I think we still haven't exhausted all possible means of trying to resolve the neoavian polytomy. This actually parallels very similar suggestions that have been made for placental mammals. In fact, there are a lot of parallels between the kind of controversies regarding the origins of placental mammals and neoavians, and I think I mentioned this in the first episode. It's almost like the very similar things happened to the two groups in their evolutionary history, namely the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction and the subsequent adaptive radiation. So the base of placental mammals is traditionally also very difficult to resolve, and it was also suggested that there might have been a hard polytomy there. But in more recent studies, I think a largely consistent topology has arisen for the base of placental mammals. And so I do think there is hope for the base of neoavians as well, even if it is a more complex problem because there are more major groups involved in terms of the polytomy there. And even if it is a partial hard polytomy, I suspect we can maybe do a little bit better than a 10-way polytomy. What do you think?
Do you think it's possible, considering that even though it's very difficult to get the arrangement right now,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that there is still sort of a structure that's being recovered,
Mm-hmm.
might that be a result of early hybridization between certain groups?
Yeah, that is certainly possible, and in fact, given the circumstances here, I think it is almost certainly the case that there was hybridization between the early ancestors of each of the major groups, because just because of how rapid it was, they probably weren't, for a time they probably weren't very much differentiated at all, and suddenly they were, right. So it's yeah, I think near the base of the tree, it's quite probable that there was some hybridization going on, or introgression is kind of the technical term for that phenomenon. Yeah, which has been discovered in quite a few major groups of organisms in recent years by looking at genomic data. So I think it's quite probable.
Right. Okay. I figured I'd be curious, like how you could tell if that was the case. Um,
Yeah, that a lot of that goes into detailed kind of phylogenomic methods that I'm not super familiar with. Um, but from my understanding, it is possible to detect at the signatures of that kind of event. In theory, of course, when we're talking about such an old divergence as this one, so this one would have happened around or shortly after the KPG mass extinction, around 66 million years ago. It probably would be a lot more difficult to actually determine whether or not these kind of mixed signals are the result of hybridization or not. So I imagine it would be more tenuous there, but certainly with more recent divergences, it has been quite possible to detect evidence of hybridization.
okay. Sweet.
Yeah, okay. I suppose we can go to the next slide then. So, for the rest of this lecture, I'll be going through a few of the major groups of neoavians. Obviously, we're going to save most of them for later episodes, but we do have time here to cover a few of the major groups. So let's get started. So the first group, we're basically going to go in order of that polytomy I presented earlier, in case you hadn't caught on to that. So the first group we're going to look at will be the Mirandornitheans, and these include the flamingos, and also a group of diving birds called grebes. Now, flamingos and grebes look very, very different from each other, and so when this close relationship, was first discovered using molecular data, uh, it was very surprising. You were like, no way, this can't be true. But since then, people have actually identified quite a number of similarities between the two different groups. Not just genetic, but also anatomical ones too. So it is now a very, very strongly supported clade.
Doesn't the
Now,
name come from, like, the name of the group come from just the sheer shock? It means like miracle birds or something
yes,
like that.
that is correct. Yeah. So yes, it means the etymology given in the paper that named Mirandornithes gives it as wonderful birds, and yes, it was because of the of how surprising this relationship was. But yes, miracle birds could be a translation of that as well. Very surprising relationship, and even more surprising is that we have found so much support for it. Yeah, there are a pretty long list of similarities that have been found shared between flamingos and grebes. I've only listed a couple of examples here that are more obvious. So first of all, both flamingos and grebes have 11 primary feathers. So these are the large flight feathers that attach to the hand of each wing. 11 primary feathers is more primaries than you see in most other bird groups. Um, I think the only other bird group that has 11 primary feathers is the storks, which are not closely related to this group, but otherwise it's only shared between the flamingos and grebes. Most birds have 10 primary feathers on each wing. And also on their feet, both flamingos and grebes have these flattened, broad nail-like claws, which is pretty unusual, and I've shown a picture of this in the slide here. Now, there are early fossils of probably stem Mirandornithians from the early Eocene, and there are fossils of crown Mirandornithians from late Eocene onwards. So we do know a little bit about their evolutionary history, as we shall see. So first of all, let's take a look at the flamingos on the next slide. And so we have fossils of total group flamingos from the late Eocene onward. There are 6 living species of flamingos. They are found on pretty much all the world's continents except for Antarctica, although they are not found in Australia anymore, but we do have fossils from as young as the Pleistocene in Australia.
Oh, that's funny. I was just thinking, there's the early scene in The Rescuers Down Under, where little Cody's flying with the giant eagle Marahute, and they actually crash through a flock of flamingos.
Oh, oh, jeez. Yeah, I've seen that movie several times, but I don't actually remember that. But it was many years ago, though. That is funny. Well, clearly that movie takes place in the Pleistocene.
I guess so.
Disregarding the technology and everything. That's pretty amazing. But yeah, it has been hypothesized that since Australia has become more arid in recent times, that might have contributed to the extinction of the Australian flamingos. But otherwise, today they're found in all the other continents. Of course, they're not found across the entire continent in all cases. They only get into North America a little bit, in Florida and places like that. But nonetheless, still a very broad distribution. Now, flamingos are very well adapted to these very extreme environments, and honestly, like, you look at a flamingo and it's really weird looking animal. Like, I'm not sure like you could come up with something like this if they didn't exist and you had to imagine them. Like, they are so odd, like the long gangly legs and the weird looking beak. We'll talk a little bit about the beak in a moment. And they are found mostly in bodies of water that are highly saline, so very salty or very alkaline. These bodies of water that most other large vertebrates cannot live in or depend upon. Sometimes these bodies of water can be super hot, like basically boiling, and yet the flamingos can just stand around in the water like it's no trouble at all, and even drink from the water. So it's very unusual. I'm not sure how much we actually know about like specific adaptations they have to saline and alkaline environments. I know we know of some, like they have salt glands and things to excrete the salt, but I don't know if we know that much about things like how they have extreme heat tolerance and things like that. And the thing is that a lot of the because these bodies of water are so hostile, a lot of them contain very specialized species of other organisms living in there. So a lot of the time they're not going to have any fish or anything. They might have brine shrimp that are suited to living in these kinds of environments. They might have big populations of algae, and sometimes those algae will produce a lot of toxins that will kill off pretty much anything living in those bodies of water. But somehow the flamingos have no problem eating the algae and drinking from the water. So, very extreme adaptations in these animals. Now, as for what flamingos eat, I alluded to them eating algae, and indeed, the bill of flamingos is highly specialized for filter feeding. Last time we talked about how a lot of the anseriforms, the duck-like birds, have these plates called lamellae in their bills, and flamingos have these too. And in fact, an early, well, not that early, I guess, somewhat old hypothesis prior to the rise of molecular phylogenetics was in fact that flamingos and ducks were closely related, which we now know is pretty much definitely wrong, but it was not a bad guess, because both of them have these filter feeding lamellae in their bills, and what flamingos will do is that they will hold their heads kind of upside down underneath the water, and then use their tongues to kind of pump water through the sides of their bill and filter out the things they like to eat using their lamellae. So most of the things that they're filtering out, there might be things like algae, but also small crustaceans. And you'll notice that the shape of the bill is very weird, with a very, that kind of down curved structure. And in addition, the lower jaw is much taller than the upper jaw, which is very odd, because normally, you would expect the upper jaw to be taller in most other birds. And why is this? Well, the down curve, that is because if you imagine kind of a straight-billed bird opening its mouth, you'll see how the tips of the jaws kind of separate very far from each other when a bird opens its mouth. And, that seems obvious, right? But that is not very efficient for filter feeding, because you want to keep your mouth, your gape, at kind of a constant small angle when you're filter feeding, so you can filter out the very, very small particles you want to eat, right? So the flamingo's bill is down curved so that the tips of the bill are kept, reasonably close together even when the bill is open. And as for the kind of mismatch between the upper and lower bill in terms of their size, this is because, well, when a flamingo is feeding, it's holding its head upside down in the water, and so kind of the roles of the upper and lower jaw become kind of reversed, and so that's why they have kind of this reversed bill. Something else that's pretty unusual about flamingos is that they feed their young using a substance called crop milk. So they basically secrete a milky substance from the inside of their digestive system, and then they cough it up to feed their babies with. There is a photo that kind of went somewhat viral I saw a while ago, which showed a flamingo, like, it's dribbling a kind of red liquid that looked a bit like blood onto another flamingo's head. And what was going on in that photo was actually, it was a flamingo trying to feed its young with the crop milk, which was the red fluid, but the two flamingos were kind of getting in the way of each other, and so one of them ended up getting the crop milk all over the other one's head instead of inside the young's mouth. So yeah.
This image, I'll have to check it out.
Oh yeah. I'm pretty sure it's probably not too difficult to find. Yeah. Do you have anything else to mention about flamingos?
Oh, they're really fun animals. At Sylvan Heights, you can feed them.
Oh, cool.
Going in. Now, I knew that they were filter feeders,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't expect them to be rough when they ate out of the hand.
Yeah.
I figured, scoop up some stuff and then gobble it down. But no, they're very delicate.
Yeah.
What they do is, like, they'll take one little food pellet at a time, then bring their head down to the water and filter feed, like you described.
Right.
And then they'll keep doing this over and over again until they get their fill.
Wow, that's really cool. Very methodical. So, well, what did you feed them?
Well, it's like a weird bird food mix.
Right.
It's like special, like, nutrition rich grains.
Right.
It kind of looks like dog food a little bit, or cat food. I guess bird chow is what they call it.
Right. Oh, that's pretty cool.
But I imagine, like, they make sure it's tailor made, because there's only a few of the birds at the park that you can feed.
Mm-hmm.
So you can feed it to the parrots, and you can feed it to the flamingos, which is an interesting mix.
Yeah, for sure.
But no, they're really gentle birds, and we were fortunate when we went, me and my sister, because they started nesting and laying eggs.
Oh, cool.
So we got to see some of these mud top nests that they make with
Right.
a little single egg in the center, and then they would come every so often and just sit on it with their long legs sticking out, and that's really fun.
Yeah, that is definitely really cool. And yes, we will mention how their nests differ from the grebes when we get to the grebes. Yeah, that's very cool. Flamingos are also very, very social birds. They like to live in very large flocks. And definitely they depend upon kind of the very extreme nature of their habitats a lot of time to keep away from predators. So because nothing else wants to live where they live, so they stay safe that way. Now, there are a number of flamingo fossils known. I mentioned the ones from Australia, but one of the kind of most notable and most abundant groups of stem flamingos are the paleolodids on the next slide. And so this is a group of, well, stem flamingos, but they do differ in some notable ways from the modern flamingos. And their fossils are known from at least the Oligocene onwards all the way to the end of the Pleistocene. So paleolodids actually lived until very, very recently in geologic terms. They've been found, yeah, also on pretty much all the continents except for Antarctica. And one of the ways in which they are different from crown flamingos is that their hind limbs are not quite as long. You can still see in the picture here that they're pretty long legs, but not to the extreme seen in the modern flamingos. And it has been suggested that their hind limbs show more adaptations for swimming. Now, modern flamingos can swim, and they can swim very well, and they swim quite often. But the vast majority of the time, they are wading through the water and not swimming. Whereas it seems like the paleolodids might have been more adapted for swimming. And like modern flamingos, they might have fed in saline lakes because they have very well developed salt gland depressions on their head. So salt glands are, of course, the organs that excrete salt, excess salt when a bird, well, it's especially well developed in a lot of sea-going birds, as you might imagine. And when these salt glands are very large, there are often these depressions in the skull that contain the salt glands. And we can see that the paleolodids have these very well developed depressions for the salt glands, so it is thought that they might have also fed in saline lakes. But they probably fed in a very different way, because unlike modern flamingos, and you can see in the photo here that they do not have like the very sharply down curved bill. They have a very straight bill, and it doesn't seem like their bill contains any room to attach lamellae. So they probably weren't filter feeders. They might have eaten, small-ish invertebrates, it has been suggested, because in some of the places where we find paleolodid fossils, there are also very abundant fossils of snails and traces of insect larvae. So they might have eaten these small but not quite microscopic invertebrates by picking them up with the bill. Interesting radiation of stem flamingos that weren't quite like the modern flamingos. Do you have anything else to add?
Nope.
Okay, let's see. On the next slide, we're going to get to the other modern group of Mirandornithes, and that is the grebes. And the grebes don't have a very good early fossil record, so they're not very well known from the Paleogene. There are some undescribed grebe fossils from the Oligocene, at least, but other than that, not much. Otherwise, they're only known from the Miocene onwards. We do have a number of good grebe fossils from then on, but it's pretty weird that we don't have good fossils of them from before that. They're a little bit more diverse than the flamingos. There are around 20 living species, and they can also be found pretty much worldwide except for Antarctica. Have you ever seen any wild grebes?
Unfortunately, no.
Huh.
I'm more familiar with them through wildlife documentaries.
Right.
Of course. The mating dances that they do are very well known.
Right. Yeah, definitely. They have spectacular courtship rituals where the two partners will kind of do a synchronized dance in many cases, sometimes running across the surface of the water by paddling their feet really quickly. Yeah, definitely very cool. I think the species that I most commonly saw in eastern North America is called the pied-billed grebe, which is a pretty interesting species. But yeah, I know you mentioned previously when we were talking about ducks that you don't see the diving species or diving specialists as often. So I suppose that might be the same reason you haven't really seen any grebes around.
Yeah, maybe it's like I'd have to go towards the coast
Right.
to really see them.
Yeah. But otherwise, they are reasonably common if in suitable habitat. Here in England, the great crested grebe is fairly easy to see. You can see them even in city parks that have large ponds in them sometimes. Um,
Yeah,
so
I've always thought those were so pretty.
yeah, yeah, they're really spectacular, especially in their breeding plumage. If any of listeners, you know, have access to large bodies of water, keep an eye out, and you might be able to see some. Now, grebes are very specialized for diving, and so you can see that their legs are much shorter than in the flamingos. Their legs are also set very far back on the body, which makes them very clumsy on land. They can, well, they can barely walk, or at least it's very exhausting for them to walk around on land. Uh, there are videos of grebes and photos of grebes kind of running around, and well, what they can do is they can kind of rear back and balance themselves on their hind limbs for a little bit of time and run, kind of. But it's very awkward for them to do so. So they definitely prefer to spend most of their time in the water. And very unusually, they do not have webbed feet, which is unlike flamingos and unlike a lot of the other water-dwelling birds. Instead of what they have what we call lobed toes. So you can see this very well in the photo I picked here, that each of their toes have this kind of separate flap surrounding it, and so these are lobe-toed feet. And it has been suggested that these types of feet allow them to swim much more quickly and more efficiently compared to webbed feet, just by the way they generate a lift in the water. So I am not a swimming biomechanist, so I do not know all the details very well. But basically, what a lot of web-footed birds use is a type of swimming method called drag-based locomotion. The propulsion that they generate with their feet, kind of paddling back and forth, is generated by drag, which works pretty well at small body sizes and allows them to be pretty maneuverable, but it is energetically more costly. Whereas the lobe-toed kind of configuration of grebes allows them to use a method called lift-based swimming, which is more efficient and probably allows them to accelerate to higher maximum speeds. So that is pretty interesting. Now, of course, the grebes use their spectacular diving skills to catch food, and so they will dive under the water, and in the larger species will chase after fish, but a lot of them will catch things like aquatic crustaceans, especially things like small aquatic insects, insect larvae, things like that. So they are aquatic predators. And a very unusual behavior exhibited in grebes is that they eat their own feathers. That is really weird, and as far as I know, no other birds do this. And in fact, it apparently is such an important part of their way of life that parent grebes will actually feed feathers to their babies, as part of their kind of diet. So it's really interesting.
It is strange.
Yeah, and it has been debated for a long time why they eat their own feathers, and many different hypotheses have been suggested. And I know the earliest one that I became familiar with when I was reading, books about birds when I was younger, it was that maybe the feathers provide a cushion to protect the inside of the digestive system from fish bones. It's like, well, that seems like a reasonable hypothesis, but more recent studies have shown that, first of all, the feathers do not actually prevent fish bones from contacting the sides of the digestive system, so it doesn't seem likely that's for that. And additionally, it's not the fish-eating grebes that ingest the most feathers, but the more crustacean-eating species. So what's up with that? Uh, a fairly recent paper from 2017 suggested that the most likely and primary function of eating feathers might be to serve as digestive aids, which is interesting. Now, many birds, at least, will ingest things like grit, like small pebbles, sand grains, things like that to aid in digestion. Flamingos will ingest grit, but grebes don't seem to. Instead, depend more on kind of chemical digestion of their food, so stomach acid and stuff like that. But because the crustaceans they eat are often very small, it is very easy for the crustaceans to just kind of pass through their entire digestive system without really being digested. Of course, that's obviously not a very efficient way of processing your food. And so it seems that what the feathers do is that they kind of entrap the food that they eat for a longer period of time inside the gut so it can be digested. And so making the digestion more efficient.
That is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, right? Super weird. And as for why the grebes do this, like why don't any other birds do this? Well, the author of this paper suggested that maybe the earliest, stem grebes were not specialized divers yet, even though they were swimming out away from the shore to find food. They might have been feeding at the surface, and so they couldn't dive down to the bottom of a body of water to collect the grit that they needed from the bottom. So instead, they started eating their own feathers that fell onto the water surface and were available as digestive aids, and then that kind of carried over to the modern grebes even after they became specialized divers. It's a pretty speculative hypothesis, but it is possible, and certainly we know that the ancestors of grebes don't seem to have started as specialized diving birds, because obviously flamingos are not, and as we shall see, stem members of Mirandornitheans don't seem to have been. So it is quite possible that they were originally not, already adapted to diving very deep, and then had to kind of make do in this manner. Now, I mentioned or alluded to nests earlier, and so the nests of grebes are very different from those of flamingos. Instead of mud nests like flamingos build on shore, grebes will build nests made out of floating vegetation, and they just kind of, they just collect vegetation and weave them into a nest that floats on the surface of the water. Usually they'll anchor it to like a reed bed or to the side of to the shore or something like that, but the nest itself is floating on the surface. Very odd. Very interestingly, there is a fossil nest from the Miocene of Spain that has been interpreted as having belonged to a stem flamingo, and this is mostly because the flamingo fossils are very common at that particular fossil site, which is a very interesting idea. And that nest was made out of twigs. So the author suggested that this was a floating nest of twigs made by stem flamingos, and so that this was kind of a shared habit. A floating nest was a shared behavior that was practiced by early flamingos and grebes. It's possible, but of course it is very difficult to be entirely sure that that nest really belongs to a flamingo. And some people have pointed out that, well, maybe it was the nest of a land bird that got washed into the water or something like that and got preserved there. So, interesting idea. It's hard to be very sure about it. The last bullet point I have here is that a few grebe species are flightless. Most of them, I think pretty much all the living flightless grebe species are from South America, and these are grebes that live in just very, very large lakes and never have to come to shore. They nest on the water surface anyways. They're very dependent on reed beds though, and many of them are highly endangered because since they're flightless, they can't really move anywhere else, and so if their habitat is under threat, which in many cases they are very vulnerable. Do you have anything else to add about grebes?
I think if I remember, one of the early inspirations for Sylvan Heights,
Uh-huh.
for John Lubbock, who was the founder, was that he was called for conservation work to work on one of these. I forget if they're flightless grebes or
Uh-huh.
just grebes that could fly, but a particularly rare species that
Yeah,
they
yeah.
didn't get there in time to help the population.
Oh,
It's one of those ones that ended up going extinct
right, right,
very
right.
recently. So I do think about that a lot when I think about grebes.
Yeah, that's pretty sad. Yeah, there are a number of recently extinct species, and one of them was flightless, the Adelan grebe from South America.
That's sad.
Yeah, hopefully we won't lose any more within our lifetimes.
For sure.
On the next slide, I do have a fossil just to show that fossils of grebes exist, and some of them are pretty good fossils. This is a Theornis from the Miocene of Spain, and you can see that it's pretty much a complete skeleton. There are even some feathers preserved. It's pretty much only lacking the skull, but otherwise the rest of the skeleton is there. So we have some pretty good grebe fossils, but very unusually, we don't have good fossils from the Paleogene yet. So maybe, hopefully someday we'll find some. Yeah, I guess it would make sense if early grebes were more surface swimming birds that didn't have as dense bones as diving grebes. Um, they might have been more difficult to preserve. That could be a possible reason, but I suppose we'll have to see. So on the next slide here, I have shown another interesting fossil bird called Tarsus. Is known from two species, one from Europe and one from North America. The photo shown here is a European species, and you can see that it has quite long hind limbs. So this is a bird that's not very big. It's smaller than the smallest flamingos, um, but the hind limbs are very long relative to its body size. And it has a number of features that are similar to Mirandornitheans in its vertebrae and its hind limb bones, and its wing bones too. Um, but it doesn't have nail-like claws on the feet, and it doesn't have some of the other features that are found in crown Mirandornithians. So it has been hypothesized that this is a stem Mirandornithian. And on the next slide here, I show kind of the hypothesized relationships between the major groups. So of course, paleolodids are stem flamingos, and the grebes are the modern sister group, the closest living relatives to flamingos, and Tarsus as a stem Mirandornithian. You can see here that since Tarsus seems to have been a wading bird with those very long legs, whereas the paleolodids seem to have been less adapted for wading than the modern flamingos, it's not really clear, how many times wading evolved in Mirandornithes. Like, was it kind of a convergent between Tarsus and flamingos, or was it ancestral and then the paleolodids became more adapted for swimming, and grebes, of course, became more specialized for diving instead? That is still unresolved. Do you have anything else to add?
Nope.
Cool. I guess we can go on to the next group. Next group is Columbimorphae. And Columbimorphae is split into these three main living groups. And, well, normally I would go over some of the shared features of this major group. But the thing about this group is that so far it has largely been recovered using molecular data with not many anatomical features identified shared between all members of the clade yet. So we don't really have much to say about that at this point. Hopefully that will change in the future. And the main reason for that is actually because of this group on the left, the mesites. These are a very weird group. We'll talk about them in a bit more detail later, but they are basically very unlike the other Columbimorphs in terms of their superficial anatomy, or overall anatomy even. They're quite a weird group of birds. Whereas the other two groups, the sandgrouse and the pigeons, have long been recognized as potential close relatives. So they are very, very similar to each other in many ways. The close relationship between them is not that surprising. But when you throw the mesites into the mix, especially when the recent molecular studies seem to indicate that they're more closely related to the sandgrouse than to the pigeons, the similarities become a lot less obvious.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I remember. I think I still have books that where they not only lump the sandgrouse with the pigeons,
Yeah,
they include sandgrouse as pigeons,
right.
that lineage. And of course, mesites. Yeah, those were that was they were grouped with the cranes and the
That's right.
rail upon a time.
Yep, that is absolutely right. Yeah, on the next slide, we will talk a bit more about the mesites. And yes, indeed, they were once grouped together with the cranes and rails instead. And in fact, a lot of different kind of mostly ground-dwelling bird groups were kind of thrown into that same category. But nowadays we know that they have not all of them are closely related at all and are kind of scattered across different parts of the bird tree. And as it turns out, the mesites were closely related to the pigeons instead. So that's very odd. People have pointed out some similarities between them. For example, mesites share with sandgrouse and pigeons like these very long slit-like openings for the nostrils in the skull. They also have some of the vertebrae in their back fused with each other. But these features are not unique to the Columbimorphs, so it's hard to say how far back those traits go. Now, so far we don't have any identified fossils of the mesites yet, so they're only known from recent times. It would be really, really cool to find fossils of them. Maybe that will help us, better understand their pigeon-like roots, presumably. There are only 3 living species, and all of them are found only in Madagascar, and they're very, very poorly studied, so we don't really know much about them. Very hard to observe as well. But we do know they seem to be mostly terrestrial, mostly spend time foraging on the ground. I think they're omnivorous, so they'll eat. They don't seem to be that picky, and they do nest in low trees and shrubs. But apparently the young leave the nest very quickly after hatching, and they'll just jump down to the ground to be with the adults. So yeah, they don't spend very long in the trees, and they don't fly very much. So in fact, I've read that the mesites do not have a wishbone. Like they don't have any collarbones at all. So the wishbones of a bird are the equivalent of fused collarbones. But apparently they don't have any collarbones at all. And of course, the collarbone or the wishbone, it serves a rather important function in flight. It serves as kind of a shock absorber, a spring as the wings flap. So you can see that they have a very reduced reliance on flight. So yeah, they'll fly to get into the trees and presumably to escape from predators, because there are somewhat large predators on Madagascar. But yeah, they don't do it very much. Do you have anything else to add about them?
Nope.
All right, then let's look at the sandgrouse on the next slide. The sandgrouse do have a better fossil record. In fact, they probably have the best fossil record out of the Columbimorph groups, which is surprising enough. Yeah, there are some probably late Eocene fossils of sandgrouse from Europe, and they're not super complete fossils, but there's enough of them to show that these probably are sandgrouse. From then onwards, there are a few other fossil sandgrouse species. I'll show one in the slide after this. There are 16 living species, and they are found in open, arid habitats of Eurasia and Africa, very dry deserts and places like that. And they also primarily feed on a very dry diet, namely seeds. That's pretty much all they eat. But despite this, they actually have to drink water daily. So what they'll do is they have to fly very long distances to traveling to water sources where they drink. And so, as you might imagine, they're very good flyers. Now, of course, they don't hatch out being able to fly. So what happens is that the males will actually carry water to their chicks. And so what they'll do is that when they make their daily trip to the watering hole, they will soak their belly feathers in the water, and their feathers are specially structured so that they can soak up the water like a sponge, and then they'll carry the water back, flying back, and then pass the water on to their chicks. So that's a very, very cool adaptation.
Yeah, I remember seeing that on one of Attenborough's documentaries.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah, super interesting. So very interesting group of birds, very arid adapted, but still very dependent on water. And on the next slide, we have one of these fossil sandgrouse. This one was only described this year, in fact. This is a species from the Miocene of China. And what you're looking at here on the left is the fossil itself embedded in the rock. And on the right is kind of a 3D scan of the fossil. So they have kind of, in a computer, removed the stone and then kind of colored in the bones so you can see them. And it's a partial skeleton. It's mostly consisting of the forelimb bones, the wing bones, and the shoulder girdle. But there's enough there to tell it's a sandgrouse. The wing bones of sandgrouse and pigeons are pretty distinctive, and so it is thought that this particular fossil site represents a fairly arid habitat, and so finding the sandgrouse here is pretty consistent with that. All right. I don't know. Do you have anything else to add about sandgrouse?
Not really.
All right. Then let's look at the pigeons. And the pigeons are definitely by far the most diverse group of these three in the Columbimorphs. There are over 300 species. Obviously, we are very familiar with the rock pigeon, Columbolivia, which has been introduced to many places all over the world and become domesticated. But pigeons are much more diverse than just that one species. For example, you can see here I chose a picture of a fruit dove. This is a group of very colorful looking pigeons from Southeast Asia. They're pretty striking. There's
a favorite in zoos that I've noticed when they do like aviaries or tropical birds of Asia. They pull out all the stops.
Right.
Like I know the crowned pigeons.
Yes.
Where they have, like this huge mohawk of feathers on the head.
Yep.
And then there's the bleeding heart,
yes,
which is very, very striking. It looks like a bird that's like injured on its chest.
Right.
The feathers are colored.
Yes, that's right. Hence its name. Yeah. There are some very, very colorful tropical pigeons, very striking. So yeah, definitely more than just your average city pigeons. And the pigeon fossil record is not great. We don't have them from the very early parts of the Paleogene. There are some fossils from the Oligocene onwards, but yeah, not a very good fossil record for pigeons. And nowadays they can be found worldwide except for Antarctica, so very successful group. And there are both the terrestrial and arboreal species. So the fruit dove I have pictured here is they're a more arboreal group. They spend most of their time in trees, but other groups of pigeons will often feed on the ground. Some of them spend most of their time on the ground. So there's quite a diversity of lifestyles there. And most pigeons are primarily herbivorous, so they'll either eat mostly seeds or mostly fruits. And in fact, some of them are very important as seed dispersers, especially a lot of the tropical species. There's a group called the imperial pigeons, which are some of the larger species of pigeon, and they are very important seed dispersers. Many tropical trees depend on them for seed dispersal. They can fly very far. I have a bullet point further down talking about how pigeons are very strong flyers, so they can fly to very long distances, and of course, accordingly, they have probably contributed to the actual distribution of many types of trees. A very unusual feature of pigeons is that they can drink using suction, and what I mean by this is that they can dip their bill into the water and just suck up the water straight into their throat. Now, you might not think that's that weird because we can drink using suction, right? But it is very weird for birds. Most birds, what they'll do is they'll kind of scoop up water with their beak, and then they have to tip their head back so that it flows down their throat. So they drink with the assistance of gravity. But pigeons don't need to do this, so they can just suck up the water straight into their beak. And there are a few other groups of birds that can do this, but not that many. So it's a very unusual pigeon feature. And interestingly, like flamingos, pigeons feed their young using crop milk. And so they don't cough up kind of half-digested bits of food for their young to eat. So instead, they will feed their young by secreting a milky substance from the inside of their digestive system. And I've seen wood pigeons do this. So wood pigeon is one of the more common pigeon species that can be seen here in England. I've seen a young wood pigeon kind of begging for food from presumably its parent. So it came up next to its parent, and it kind of used its wings to smack its parent around, and then its parent turned around and then opened its bill, and then the young just kind of stuffed its head inside the throat of its parent. And it seemed very awkward in terms of the kind of motion they need to use, but evidently it works for them. So evidently the parent was just coughing up crop milk for the baby, and it didn't have enough after that, so it begged for some more. Um, but yeah, interesting adaptation. You might recall in some of those phylogenetic trees, Columbimorphae and Mirandornitheans are pretty closely related. So I do wonder if crop milk could potentially be an ancestral trait in in the shared ancestor of these two groups, if they are indeed close relatives. Of course, they would have had to be lost in some of these other groups, like the sandgrouse and the grebes and the mesites. But interesting to think about. I don't know if anyone's really looked into that.
Yeah, I
Uh,
wonder if there's
yeah,
a genetic signature for producing crop milk that you can
right,
find, and you can see if it's like present but turned off in the
right.
ones where they produce crop milk that are related.
Yeah, I would be really curious to find out about that. I'm not sure anyone has done that study. Um, And yes, as kind of alluded to earlier, the pigeons are very strong flyers. Of course, they can fly very fast and fly for very long distances. Of course, this is one of the reasons they have been traditionally used to deliver messages, still are in some cases. And they have been able to spread to very remote islands. Many of the Pacific islands they have been colonized by pigeons, and in some cases, pigeons have evolved flightlessness. Now, I don't think any of the living pigeon species are flightless, but many of the flightless species did live until very recently and were only driven to extinction by human interference, I guess you could say. Of course, the most famous example of a flightless pigeon is shown on the next slide here, and that is the dodo.
Hmm.
Yeah, so of course there's a icon of extinction, and the poster child of anthropogenic Holocene extinctions is the dodo. And the dodo was a giant pigeon that lived on the island of Mauritius. One of the largest pigeons that we know of. So there have been some debate about exactly how big dodos could get. But it was probably in the ballpark of at least 15 kilograms or so, so the size of a large turkey. Now, even though a dodo is so iconic and so well known, we actually know very, very little with certainty about its life appearance and its behavior. Like, almost nothing is known about its behavior, to be honest. Like, there just haven't been any kind of records, and they went extinct so quickly after they were discovered by humans that, yeah, we just don't know too much about them. It's
Yeah, it's like that time before the really rigorous field work
mhm,
to kind of piece together the lives of these birds. Yeah, I know the actual extinction of the dodo
mhm.
is a bit of an interesting story. I
Right,
Additionally, the narrative is like, oh well, humans, because like Mauritius did not have any indigenous populations. It
right.
was the dodos and giant tortoises, I think, and a
Yep.
couple other organisms that kind of hung out there.
Hmm.
And then the Dutch, I want to say it's the Dutch, they
Yeah,
arrived on the island, and I mean, being an island species that's not used to people, they were very, um, they weren't afraid of the
that's right.
human.
Yeah.
You could kind of walk up to them and pet them, and then they'd be none the wiser. Um,
Right.
so it was because of this that a hunter could walk up and club one, and it wouldn't get any fear that
Right.
I think the name comes from. Like they had uh, it's Raphis cuculatus
Mm.
now,
Yeah.
but I remember there was one species name. It was like Didus pedis, which
Right.
basically
Or ineptus or something. Yeah.
like that.
Right.
And so like they would take these, and apparently they didn't even taste really good. It's like when
Yeah.
you're out at sea and you only eat like bread and water, it's like anything anything is better than that. So
Right.
they
Right.
eat these birds and fatten them up, which is why you have all these woodcuts showing these very plumpy birds.
Hmm.
When I imagine they weren't as plumpy in life in the wild.
Right.
But now, if I believe this is correct, the main cause of extinction was when the Dutch arrived and they brought pigs
Hmm.
and rats.
Yeah.
And because the dodos are flightless, they were ground nesting, and so these animals would come and eat the eggs and
Hmm.
eat the babies. And
Right.
when you do that, of course, well, you just doom the whole population on such a small island like that,
Yeah.
and that's really how they died out.
Right.
I know they haven't they did not get the zoo treatment like other wild animals
Mm.
have. I can't recall dodos ever being taken to like England or something to be
Mm.
put on display for kings or something. The only thing I remember was the Mughal emperors in India. They had a huge menagerie,
Mm.
and India is close to Mauritius. It's in the
Right.
Indian Ocean, and so they prided themselves with their wildlife artists to take really accurate illustrations of different birds. And I
Mm.
believe it's been argued that one depiction of the dodo that they had found among the Mughals, this very dark brown yellowish feather coloration,
Yep.
that seems to be the closest contender for the life appearance. But even then, there's still some uncertainties as to how reliable that source is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're pretty much spot on with all that. As often, our friend Darren Naish has written a very good blog post about a life appearance of the dodo and what we know and don't know about it. So I think I'll link that in the description. Um, but yes, that is right. In a lot of yeah, I know in a lot of my children's books, we had a very simplistic description of the extinction of the dodos. Like, yeah, the humans came and viewed the dodos as stupid and then ate them all, basically. But yeah, it does seem more likely that it was the invasive species that were brought to the island that kind of did them in. Um, and so it's generally thought that the dodos went extinct in the 17th century. And yeah, apparently they weren't that good to eat, or at least according to many of the accounts. And even though, like many other island animals, they were kind of, what we say, naive to danger, uh, there have been studies done on kind of the brain structure of dodos, and it's been found that it's they probably, in terms of like their cognitive skills, there's no evidence that they were any less intelligent than a typical pigeon would be. And you might not think pigeons are very intelligent, but obviously they're smart enough to get by, and they actually are capable of some pretty complex cognitive tasks. So yeah, kind of naivety to predators is not the same thing as stupidity, I guess you could say.
Oh yeah, and I think the whole thing with animal intelligence, it's such an interesting thing with me because it always seems like when we're talking about animals being intelligent, it's always in response to human intelligence.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
the more
Right.
human like the cognition is, then the more intelligent the animal is.
Right, right. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what you need to be to survive in your environment. So
Exactly, exactly.
that always seemed weird to me.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah, a lot of our notions of intelligence are definitely, it's definitely a shorthand in many cases for more human-like. Um, Indeed. Right. In fact, I did want to mention this, is that there were in fact some accounts that mentioned that the dodos, they weren't entirely defenseless. In fact, like they weren't wise to the possibility of danger, but basically, if they were molested, they were capable of biting, and they have very large beaks, as you could see in this photo, so their bites could be quite painful. There was a very close relative of the dodo, which is pictured on the right here, the Rodrigues solitaire, which lived on the nearby island of Rodrigues, which was another species of large flightless pigeon. It could get the same size as a dodo, if not bigger. As a very large birds. They think they were described as being swan sized or bigger, so quite,
Oh,
yeah, quite big. Now the solitaire is probably not as iconic in pop culture as the dodo is. I can't even think of any fictional depictions of the solitaire, um, but we actually know a lot more about its behavior. Interestingly enough, we there are actually some pretty detailed records of some of the behavior of the solitaire, and um, in fact, it has been said that these might be the earliest kind of detailed observations or recorded observations of kind of avian breeding behavior ever, which is really pretty interesting. Um, Yeah. And so it turns out that the solitaire had very strong sexual dimorphism. So on the right here, the skeleton on the right here is a male, and you can see it's substantially bigger than the female. Um, I believe both the male and the female solitaires had these very unusual knobs on the wings. Yeah, you might see where this is going because last time we talked about how a lot of the anseriforms have these structures on the wings for fighting each other, and yeah, right. So the solitaires did as well. They had these very large knobs, these club-like structures on the wings, and it was observed that they would use these wings for fighting each other. Apparently, the the female in a pair would be responsible for driving away intruding females, whereas the male would be responsible for driving away intruding males. And apparently, they would use this kind of display where they would make this sound associated with flapping the wings. So either they were smacking their wings on the sides of their own bodies, or smacking the two wings together to create this very loud kind of clacking noise, presumably with the clubs. That could be heard for very very long distances, and apparently was a territorial display. So that's pretty unusual. And yes, and they would also use these clubs on humans who tried to bother them, but unfortunately, it apparently wasn't enough to prevent them from going extinct. Probably for similar reasons as the dodo.
Yeah, another casualty of the humans on island syndrome, I
Right.
guess we can call it. I do. I am just. I guess just to bring this up,
Mhm.
um, I was thinking about back in my human evolution series how there was such a need to classify humans separately from the other great apes because they were so different
Yeah,
in anatomy. I do remember that happened for a time with the dodo and the solitaire
that's
here.
correct. Yeah,
They were so distinct that they made their own family, Raffidae or something.
yeah.
Now, of course, we have DNA from I believe both of these species,
Yes, I
and
think so.
they're like deeply nested. I know it's like a big factoid. It's like, oh, the dodo's closest relative is and they mentioned like the Nicobar
Yeah, the
pigeon.
Nicobar pigeon. Yeah, Southeast Asia.
Yeah, which makes sense, relative distance.
Right.
I
Yeah.
always thought that was pretty funny though.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And yeah, the Nicobar pigeon is another very very striking looking pigeon species. It has these kind of long iridescent feathers along its neck and its back, which is very very cool looking. Have you seen them in zoos?
Oh, I I cannot remember.
Hmm.
I have to go through the list of zoos that I have been
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
They have. I'm gonna go ahead and say maybe.
Uh-huh.
Just I've been to a lot of aviaries where
Yeah,
they
yeah.
quite a healthy number of birds, and I wouldn't be surprised if they snuck some Nicobars in there somewhere.
Right. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. They're reasonably common in zoo aviaries. I know I've seen them a few times.
Yeah, one thing I definitely would love to see, just going back to the dodo for a
Mhm.
second.
Yeah.
I know there's like a head and a
Ah,
foot
yes, that's right.
that was salvaged from a stuffed specimen
Mhm.
that just decayed beyond all recognition, and they managed to save those pieces.
That's
And
right.
I want to say it's the London Museum of Natural
It's
History.
the Oxford dodo.
Oxford. Okay,
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
That would be incredible to see because it still has like the patch on the head with the little tufts of feathers.
That's right.
It's like I guess they. I don't know if that's because the head was mostly naked or if it's just that most of the feathers fell off. I can't remember.
Yeah, I think there's a feathered part of the head, but there's also the kind of part of the face is like bare. So yeah, that's a very very distinctive look for the dodo. Um, Yeah, that's right. That's a very cool specimen. And I guess since you brought that up, I should mention that there are a lot of models in museums of what the dodo might have looked like in life, but we don't have any kind of stuffed skins of dodos. So all the ones that looked like stuffed animals that you might have seen in museums. Those are models that are made out of feathers of like living birds and stuff. So yeah, we know very very little about the actual life appearance of the dodo.
Yeah, it would be incredible if like we just happened across some Dutch log that was hidden away for
Right.
centuries and they made these huge detailed drawings and of dodos and there's like a specimen somewhere that's just been lost.
Right.
Oh,
That would be
That
incredibly cool.
for sure. We can dream.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. But yeah, that is the sad story of the dodo and the solitaire, and these two are just basically just the best known flightless pigeon species. There are a few others that also died out in recent times, and actually a few flighted pigeon species that have gone extinct in recent times too. So in some ways, even though of course there are a number of species of pigeons that do very well today, others are under threat. So hopefully we don't lose any more.
Oh yeah, that does remind me. I should at some point in my human evolution series, I do want to talk about
Mm,
those cases in particular
sure.
because that I'm glad you brought that up. That's an interesting phenomena that seems more complex than what you might guess from the popular culture.
Right.
Um, so yeah, stay tuned for that.
That's cool. Yeah, I look forward to it. And since I didn't mention this earlier, I guess I should briefly mention is that the difference between a pigeon and a dove. Well, the answer is there isn't really much of a difference. We tend to call the smaller species doves and the larger species pigeons, but it's not an exact trend. So yeah, there isn't really any biological difference, and that's why I call them all pigeons here in this lecture. But
Right.
just so you know.
I was gonna say because yeah, I've heard that, and I've also heard that like it's a culinary thing too.
Mm,
It's like it's more appealing to say that you're eating dove versus,
right.
but I don't know how true that is.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it would make sense if that were the case. Yeah. All right, I guess we should go on to the next group. So on the next slide here, we're going to talk about this is going to be the final major group I'm going to talk about in this lecture, the Otidimorphae. And as you can see, here's another polytomy because the recent studies haven't really kind of come to a consensus on the exact topology between these three groups. So we have the turacos, the bustards, and the cuckoos. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, there actually are a few molecular studies recently that don't find all three of these to clade together. So it is possible even that not they're not actually all closely related, but the two biggest studies do recover them as a group, so that's why I'm kind of going with this here. But obviously, much more work to be done, and stay tuned.
Oh yeah, like I definitely remember like how we were talking about pigeons and sandgrouse and all
Hmm.
the old books. It was the cuckoos and the turacos
Right,
and the Watson that were
right,
all clumped together under one group, and then the bustards were another one of those uh, gruiform
right.
families that were grouped with cranes and rails.
That's right. Yep. So indeed, here, if it were just the turacos and the cuckoos, it wouldn't be so surprising because similarities between them have been noted for a long time. But with the bustards in the mix, that becomes kind of they become kind of the odd ones out. And yeah, the Hoatzin, yeah, we'll talk about the Hoatzin in a later episode, but we still aren't quite sure what it is. However, the recent molecular studies do not find it to be closely related to this group, so it seems like the similarities between it and the turacos and cuckoos are likely to be convergent evolution. But yes, definitely, the kind of large ground-dwelling bustards seem very at odds with the rest of this group. But we'll look at each of these three major groups in turn. So first of all, let's look at the turacos. The total group of turacos, we know fossils of stem turacos from the Eocene. We'll see one of them in a bit. There are over 20 living species. It's not a huge group, but there's still a fair amount of diversity there. And currently, in modern day, they are only known from Africa, but there are possible stem turacos known from North America and Europe, which is pretty interesting. And they are tree-dwelling birds that primarily eat fruit. In fact, their scientific name, the Musophagiformes, translates to the banana eaters, Musophaga, one of the genera of turacos. So they are fruit eaters, although I don't think any of them are known to actually specialize in eating bananas. Um, so that's just a name. And in keeping with kind of their tree-dwelling habits, they have what we call semi-zygodactyl feet. And so a zygodactyl foot is a particular configuration of a bird foot where there are two toes pointing backwards. So the first toe, which is usually backward pointing in all living birds, so that would be the innermost toe, or we call the hallux. And then the outermost toe, which is the equivalent of it is the fourth toe. So birds do not have a little toe, which would be the fifth toe. So it would be the equivalent to our next toe in. And so the fourth toe in a zygodactyl bird is also reversed, so they have two toes pointing backwards, and of course that gives them a very good grip on perches. So a lot of arboreal birds have this kind of foot. And turacos have what we call as a semi-zygodactyl foot. So usually the fourth toe, the outermost toe, is kind of pointing out to the side, but it can be kind of twisted around so that it points backwards, so they can have a basically functionally zygodactyl foot when they want to. Something very weird about turacos is they have these unique feather pigments that aren't found in any other kind of bird. So they have a green pigment called turacoverdin. This is really weird because in most cases, green in birds is not produced entirely by pigments. Usually it's at least in part what we call a structural color. So this is when the very structure of the feather, it doesn't have to be a feather, but since we're talking about birds, in a feather, this very structure of the feather causes light to bounce off in a way that reflects a certain type of color. The color we perceive is not being caused by some kind of pigment reflecting the light, but by the structure of the feather itself. So that's the way it is in most birds that have green coloration. So it's often in part structural color. If it's iridescent, it's basically entirely structural color. But in some cases, it might be combined with like yellow pigment. So you have structural blue overlaid by yellow pigment, and then you get green. That's how it is in some other kinds of birds. But in turacos, it is an honest-to-goodness green pigment called turacoverdin that gives them their green coloration, and you can see this in this turaco pictured here. They also have unique red pigments called turacin, which is also, as far as we know, unique to turacos. In most other kinds of birds, the color red is produced by a different type of pigment called carotenoids, which are also used by some other types of animals too. So it's very weird that turacos decide to use a different way to make the color red. It's very odd. I'm not sure if we have any ideas about why that is, but it is an interesting turaco thing.
Yeah, that's so strange.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, very unusual. So yeah, turacos, as you can see, can be really brightly colored, although I've heard that they are not super easy to observe in the wild. They can be pretty noisy, so you can detect them by their calls. But since they often live in very dense kind of rainforests, they can be very difficult to observe, especially since they're high in the trees all the time. And they also don't fly very much, so they'll fly short distances to get from tree to tree. But yeah, they don't fly for very long distances. And in fact, their wishbone has kind of become unfused in many species. So it's no longer really a wishbone. I guess it's more like the separated collarbones that we have, because they don't have to fly very strongly. So on the next slide, we will see what might be a fossil stem turaco. So the turaco fossil record is not great, but there is this one species from the Eocene of Wyoming called Foro. It has long been a kind of mystery bird. It's been very difficult to figure out what kind of bird it was, because it has a weird combination of features. However, in recent years, a phylogenetic analysis conducted by my supervisor, Daniel Field, has actually found that Foro was most likely a stem turaco, so its closest living relatives are the turacos. And there are a number of features that seem to support this. First of all, the shape of the skull is very similar to modern turacos, and also, like a lot of the modern turacos, it has an unfused wishbone, so it has kind of two separated collarbones instead. So these do seem like pretty fairly compelling features for it to be a stem turaco. Now, something that is different compared to modern turacos is that its hind limbs are much longer. In fact, these hind limb proportions are more typical of a ground-dwelling bird. So foro has been used as evidence for, the acquisition of arboreal habits in crowned birds after the KPG is that, they originate from these terrestrial ancestors like foro that only evolved into kind of specialized arboreal forms later on, like the turacos. And there have been some fossils similar to foro known from Europe, although they're not very well known yet. So it seems like these stem turacos might have had a very broad distribution in the past, even though turacos today are restricted to Africa. We will see this pattern again in some other groups later in this series. Do you have anything else to add?
Um, that's interesting that I was familiar with foro.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that it's been recovered as possibly a stem turaco, because I do remember reading Tetsu a few years back,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there was like discussion that foro was supposed to be a stem Hoatson.
Yeah, yeah, it does have some Watson-like features, and as we mentioned earlier, yeah, it used to be thought that Watsons might be closely related to turacos, in which case it would make sense. Of course, we no longer think that's the case.
Yeah.
And in the phylogenetic analysis done in that study by my supervisor, they did include Hoatzins, including fossil stem Hoatzins that were more confident are stem Hoatzins, and Furrow did not clade with them, instead claded with the turacos. So it does seem like this is the best supported hypothesis at the moment.
Oh, fascinating. Well, there you go.
Yeah, it is really interesting. So I guess we can go to the next slide. So the next group I have here are the bustards. And the bustards, somewhat oddly, because they're quite large birds, um, are not known for a very good fossil record. And in fact, they don't really have a confirmed Paleogene record at all. They're only known from the Miocene onwards, and even the fossils from the Miocene onwards are often very fragmentary. So they have pretty much a terrible fossil record, which is pretty odd. There are also over 20 living species, and they can be found across Eurasia, Africa, and Australia, usually in pretty open habitats. They're mostly ground-dwelling birds. They don't really spend any time in trees at all. I think they don't really have much of a hallux, I think, so I don't think they can even perch. Um, and they are omnivores, not very picky. They'll eat insects, plant material, small vertebrates if they can catch them. Uh, and they can get pretty big. They include some of the largest flying birds. The species pictured here, the Cory bustard, is one of the largest ones. And I know they can get in the vicinity of like 15 to 20 kilograms. So they are some of the largest living flying birds. And yeah, I think a really really big swan or a really big turkey might be able to get around that size or bigger. But other than that, the largest, the heaviest at least, living flying birds are the bustards. And the males often have very elaborate courtship displays, and you can see this pictured here in the Cory bustard on the left. So this is the male who has inflated his throat and to kind of puff out his throat feathers and display to a female. And there are some other really crazy looking bustard displays where they just kind of transform themselves into forms that don't really look like birds anymore. It's really weird. Do you have anything else to add about bustards?
It's funny you mentioned the weird courtship displays.
Yeah,
And please correct me if I'm wrong. Are the Floricans part of
yeah,
this group?
they are.
Okay,
Yes,
that's what I was thinking. Because there's one Indian species
that's
that
right.
it kind of flaps and jumps into the air. That
Yes.
display is incredible.
Yeah. That's a really weird display too, for sure. Yes, the lesser florican. There's documentary footage of this, and so you can probably find videos of it online. The males, they just jump high above the grass while flapping their wings. That is a very interesting display indeed. Um,
I
yeah.
It's kind of funny what animals we familiarize ourselves with. as
Hmm.
we age.
Yeah.
When I was really young, I was very familiar with the Cory
Hmm.
bustard because I had this search and find book, The Great Animal Search, and
Yes, I had that.
yeah, they had a whole profile on the Serengeti, or,
Yes.
or generic African savanna, and one of the animals you could find was the Cory bustard, and they stated outright that this was the largest or the heaviest flying bird in
Hmm.
the world, and so I've always had that in my head to this day.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That I did also encounter that factoid in many of my books, and including that one, which I had that as well. Very fond memories of it. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the Cory bustard is definitely the most widely known bustard, probably. Many of the others are very, very poorly known. I don't know if you've seen it was from like the mid 2000s. There was a BBC special called Animal Games. Um, and it was basically kind of the Olympics but with animals.
Huh. I'm
Yeah,
not familiar. No.
right. So it was a pretty interesting special where they basically kind of spliced footage of animals with an Olympic style arena. So it showed the animals kind of competing with each other, and it was a fun special. Of course, a lot of the special effects are pretty dated nowadays. Um, but yeah, and one of the perks or quirks, I guess, was that they resized all the animals to be the same size as humans, so they had like insects competing alongside the vertebrates. They do mention that they ignore a square cube law, so the insects were kind of like ridiculously overpowered in that competition. Um,
Gotcha. That's
yeah,
the
yeah.
thing. Oh, I'm surprised I've never heard of that. That kind of reminds me of the CGI that they do for the Most Extreme.
Right,
That
right.
show I definitely remember seeing it.
Yeah, a little bit
So
like
that
that. Yeah, yeah.
I'll have
Right.
to check that out. That's so cool.
Yeah, yeah. If you can, yeah. I'm not sure if it's online anywhere, but you could try to look for it. Um, and yeah. Anyways, what reminded me of that is that during the high jump competition, the lesser Florican was one of the competitors in that. Um, but it got disqualified for flapping its wings while it jumps. So they're like, that's kind of flying, so you can't do that.
Funny. Yeah, I mean that's a fair point.
Right, right. So yeah, that's pretty fun. They had a number of obscure species in that special too, so that was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that with me. I'll have to go do some digging.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It really I remember having a lot of fun watching it when I was younger. It was yeah, it's definitely a fun special. Um, I guess in the meantime we can move on to the next, and I guess yeah, I think this is the final group we'll talk about for this episode. These are the cuckoos. And the cuckoos also have a terrible fossil record, which I guess is a recurring theme in this episode. There are some possible cuckoo fossils known from the Eocene onwards, but a lot of time they're like a single bone here, a single bone there. So not much can be said about what they actually tell us about cuckoo evolution. Cuckoos are a lot more diverse than the turacos or the bustards. There are over 100 living species, and I see I forgot to mention their distribution on the slide, but they can be found pretty much all over the world. And they include both tree-dwelling and ground-dwelling forms. So I have pictured a common cuckoo here up top, which is probably the bird you think of if you hear the word cuckoo, at least if you're not thinking of cuckoo clocks, I guess. But the roadrunner of the greater roadrunner of the American Southwest is also a species of cuckoo, and it is a ground-dwelling species of cuckoo. Yep, very fast-running species. Pretty cool. Yeah, and if you're familiar with Roadrunners only from the Warner Brothers version, you can see that they do not look like that. Cuckoos have zygodactyl feet, so you might be able to see in the Roadrunner picture here actually that the two of their toes point backwards. So this is the first toe and the fourth toe, so the innermost and outermost toes. So this gives them a useful grip for perching, even though the ground-dwelling ones have it as well. And yep, a very diverse group with many different kind of ecologies. So some of the cuckoos are mostly insect eaters, and in fact, a lot of the insect-eating cuckoos are unusual in that they like to eat hairy caterpillars. Of course, hairy caterpillars are often poisonous, and even if they aren't, they are often not very pleasant to eat, as you might imagine. But cuckoos really go for them, so they kind of specialize in eating these insects that other birds don't like.
I was gonna say somebody's got to eat them.
Right, right. But there are also cuckoo species that are primarily fruit eaters, and there are also cuckoo species that hunt a lot of other vertebrates. The roadrunners are actually examples of this. Roadrunners will often hunt lizards, snakes in some cases, and they'll also hunt smaller birds as well. Some roadrunners get pretty good at catching hummingbirds of all things, so they're pretty impressive predators.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I gotta say, greater roadrunner is probably one of my favorite bird species in the world. I've only had limited experience in seeing them in real life, mostly in zoos, but I've actually seen them in the wild before, and they are so fun to watch.
Yeah, I think the North Carolina Zoo has roadrunners, but I don't have too many memories of
Hmm.
watching them
Yeah.
because I think every time I would go to the enclosure, like they were off exhibit for some reason.
Yeah, that's unfortunate when that when that happens. When you just
Right.
yeah, just have
Seems like
really terrible luck.
yeah. My uncle Bobby lives in the West and sort of desert farmland, so maybe he's seen quite a number of these. I'll have to ask him.
Yeah, yeah, that would be cool. I know in places where they can be found, they're not super rare, and they can be found pretty close to human habitation. So yeah, very very interesting group of birds. Um, Quite infamously, I guess, there are a number of cuckoo species that are what we call brood parasites. And what this means is that they will lay their eggs in the nests of other species of birds. And in fact, many of these parasitic cuckoos are what we call obligate brood parasites. So they never care for their own young. They depend on other bird species to, successfully rear their young. Now, not all cuckoo species do this. The roadrunners don't, for example. But species like the common cuckoo, these are brood parasites. And in fact, brood parasitism has evolved at least 3 times within cuckoos. So for some reason, they have a kind of tendency for evolving this kind of strategy.
Yeah, that's so fascinating to me. I remember I've read about this a couple of times
Mm-hmm.
how like this brood parasitism is so strong that like the cuckoos will lay eggs that resemble the eggs of other birds
That's right.
and actually like trace this down through the centuries that these birds have been studied, and
Mm-hmm.
you can see eggs slowly getting better at looking like the eggs of the birds that they parasitize.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So on the next slide, in fact, I wanted to talk about a little bit about this because it's a kind of fascinating evolutionary story. Yeah, so there are a lot of species of parasitic cuckoos, but the best studied species is probably the common cuckoo, which breeds in Europe and among other places. Yeah, there's this very fascinating story of coevolution between cuckoos and their hosts. And you are exactly right that a common cuckoo, its eggs often resemble those of the species that it parasitizes very strongly. And the reason for this is because their hosts, as they're called, their host species, can often recognize the eggs of the common cuckoo, and if they recognize the eggs, they will often destroy the eggs. They might build a new nest on top of the eggs, and so just let the cuckoo egg die, basically. Um, or yeah, they might abandon the nest altogether. So obviously, cuckoo wants its young to be successfully reared. They have been selected for laying very similar eggs that mimic those of their hosts. And indeed, you can trace this over time and see how close resemblance has gotten. Now, once the a young common cuckoo hatches, uh, what it usually does is that it has this kind of depression in its back, and what it would do is it will get underneath the eggs of its unhatched foster siblings, or if its foster siblings have hatched, it will get underneath them and then kind of shove them out of the nest, which is yeah. So they die, and the cuckoo young has food all to itself. it seems that even though the host species can recognize cuckoo eggs, at least some of the time, they don't seem to recognize a cuckoo young as being different from their own species. So they just keep feeding them and feeding them and feeding them until it grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And in many cases, it can grow even bigger than its host parents. And you can see this here. Here's a young cuckoo being fed by a reed warbler. Getting the host species to successfully rear the eggs is a challenge for the cuckoos. Not only because they can potentially recognize the eggs of the cuckoo, but also because if the if host species see adult cuckoos hanging around nearby, they will try and chase off the adult cuckoos because they recognize the adult cuckoos as being brood parasites. And so, in fact, the adult common cuckoo has evolved a very similar coloration to a sparrowhawk, which is a Eurasian sparrowhawk to be exact, which is a very dangerous predator to small birds. Yeah, the kind of gray body and striped underside of the rather barred underside is what we call it. The barred underside of a common cuckoo is very much like European sparrowhawk, and so oftentimes when cuckoo comes by and the host species will hide away or fly away because they think it's a sparrowhawk coming, and then they won't think to chase off the cuckoo. Cuckoo gets a chance to lay its eggs in the nest of another bird. However, there have been populations of host species that have been able to recognize a cuckoo despite this mimicry. And so there is actually a second color morph of the common cuckoo where it can, instead of being gray, it can become this rufous brown, kind of reddish brown color. And so in places where the gray morph is recognized as a threat by host species, as like a brood parasite by host species, the red morph is more successful because they haven't learned to recognize it yet, and it can lay eggs discreetly in the nests of other birds. Whereas, in places where maybe the red morph has been recognized, maybe the gray morph is more successful. So, again, very, very complex kind of web of coevolution going on here.
Yeah, that's. Oh my gosh, I wonder, like, what were the circumstances that led up to the whole thing in the first place?
Right, right. Yeah, the kind of story of brood parasitism is just really many stories because there are many species of brood parasites. It's just incredible, and you could easily do a whole lecture on just this topic. Actually, I would not be surprised if someone could do an entire course on just this topic because there are so many complexities involved. Um, I guess one last thing I'm going to mention is not about the common cuckoo, but in some other species of cuckoo, it has been found that they engage in what has been called mafia behavior. And so what this is that if a host species recognizes the egg of the cuckoo and rejects the egg, what will happen is that adult cuckoos will actually come back, check on the egg, and if they see that it has been rejected, they will prey on the eggs of the host species, and in doing so, kind of encourage the host species to, you better accept the next egg, or else this will happen again. And it has been experimentally shown that this does seem to work on the host species. They will become more receptive to cuckoo eggs when this happens.
That is so nuts.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. This really complex uh, interplay between species. It's so fascinating. All right. On the next slide, I said that the cuckoo fossil record is really bad, but I didn't want to mention this species or these few species. So these are quite recent species from the Pleistocene of Australia. So on the left, these are all upper arm bones, so humeri. The left three humeri are fossil species of the genus Centropus, and the right two humeri are modern species of Centropus. The Centropus cuckoos are known as cuckoos. They are some of the non-parasitic cuckoos, and they can get reasonably sized. The modern cuckoos can get to like over a kilogram, I think. So the size of a chicken thereabouts. And they're mostly ground-dwelling cuckoos, so they often hide in vegetation near the ground, so they're pretty hard to observe, or can be. And they'll eat like small animals, or smaller animals, things like that. But there used to be even larger species of cuckoos that lived in Australia, and these are the species Centropus colossus and Centropus maximus, shown on the right here. And these cuckoos have been estimated as having weighed, probably over 2 kilograms. So, like a large chicken or a small turkey, maybe. So these were the largest known cuckoos, and probably they might not have been able to fly very well. And there's also a third species of extinct cuckoo that is smaller, closer in size to the modern species, called Centropus bairdi. But yeah, I just wanted to mention these because largest known cuckoos ever. Um, there actually was a really good poster this year at SVP, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, a conference that I mentioned earlier, where it was basically focused on doing a life restoration of Centropus maximus. And so the author basically used phylogenetic bracketing and ecological inferences to predict kind of a plausible color scheme for this species, and then kind of reconstructed based on the proportions we know from fossil bones, and based on the soft tissues, based on what we know of modern species. And she came out with like a really incredible piece of paleo art depicting this animal. And apparently she plans on doing more Cenozoic birds in the future. And of course, Cenozoic birds are a very underrepresented group in paleo art, so I really look forward to seeing more of her work.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah.
I can't see that.
Yeah. I hope it gets published someday. Really look forward to seeing that. Anyway, I think this is the last slide I have on cuckoos. So, do you have anything else to add?
No, this is great.
Yeah, cool. I guess while I'm here, there's also a song about Centropus maximus. Interestingly enough, which is pretty cool because obviously you don't really get songs about Cenozoic fossil birds every day. It is by the musician Professor Flint, who specializes in writing songs about paleontology, and especially about Australian paleontology. He actually performed at the SVP conference last year, which took place in Brisbane, which was pretty interesting. So he has written a song about Centropus maximus, which I'll link in the description.
Yeah, that's a very niche song.
It really is. Yeah. Right. So then on the next slide, I show this polytomy of neoavians again, just as a bit of review. So as you can see, we have gone through 3 of the major groups pictured here. We have covered Mirandornitheans, Columbimorphs, and Otidimorphs. So next time, as we shall see on the next slide, we will cover the next group, Strisaures. This is a very interesting group to me. I think they're a very interesting group in general, even if I haven't studied them. But since I have, I think they're especially interesting. The first paper I authored as the first author was a study on these species, looking at their phylogeny. And this group includes a number of nocturnal groups, such as the nightjars and the frogmouths, which are pictured on the left here. But they also include the swifts, which are a very incredible group of birds, some of the most aerial birds in the world, which is saying something, since obviously birds are known for being able to fly. And of course, the hummingbirds, which are a very remarkable group of birds. I think most people would agree. So I'm very excited to do Strisaures for the next episode of Dinosaurs, the second chapter. How about you?
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it as well. Get deep into this group. I mean, hummingbirds. As we'll see, I'm quite fond of them as well.
Yeah, they are cool. I don't know how you couldn't love them, really.
Yeah, sweet little birds.
Yeah. As for our acknowledgements, as usual, we would like to thank Henry and Alicia. And of course, regarding the correction on the identity of the Moanalo, I'd like to thank Ilari for that. And again, I'm sorry if I butcher your name very badly. I don't speak Finnish. And as usual, you can follow us on Twitter for updates, as well as our YouTube channel, which you're probably on right now. And if you have questions for us, you can send them to our email. I have links to references in the description for this episode. So, what is our next episode going to be?
I do believe it is the next episode of my Human Evolution
Mm-hmm.
series, where I talk about Australopithecines and I kind of go deeper into the story of bipedalism as well as the first stone tools. So
Great.
that should be good. And then I think after that, is it going to be another news episode, right?
It might
For
be, yeah. I'll have to check. But I'm definitely looking forward to the next chapter of your series, which we'll see next. So that's cool.
oh, thank you.
So I guess with that, hope everybody's staying safe and take care.
Yeah, see y'all later.